House has considered gender-specific religious persecution. Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Strangford for calling this debate. And forgive me, Minister, but several of the points which he has made, I too will be making. But I think that bearing in mind the numbers of women, indeed the millions of women around the world who are suffering these abuses, they bear repetition. Freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental human right, extending to everyone, everywhere, without distinction of any kind, such as race, ethnicity, gender, political or other opinion, economic or social status. The three main components of FORB are the right to have a religion or belief, to change this, and to practice it. Unfortunately, millions around the world today cannot do so freely. And whilst religious persecution against men tends to be focused and often public, such as killings during conflict, religious persecution against women is more likely to be complex and hidden, but it too can be very violent. Indeed, global FORB violations against women, as women, I believe can be characterised in three words: complex, violent, and hidden. Yet despite the often distinctive nature of FORB abuses of women, often sexual, until recently much of the research and data on FORB has been gender blind, possibly because the majority of official representatives of religion and belief communities across the world are men, and possibly also because their experiences have been used as a default reference. Yet in many societies, men and women live very different lives. Women all too often don't have the same access to resources. They are assigned different roles in societies, and many women do not exercise the same autonomy as men, even in relation to their religion or belief practices in their local communities, let alone in other ways. What's becoming increasingly clear is that the factors which result in religious persecution against women are many and complex, and we all, including those of us, and I include myself, who work on FORB for much of the time, need to better understand these. Some work has been done on this by the FCDO in response to the Truro Review recommendation number 5, but not, in my view, enough. And I want to put that on record now as the 3-year deadline for the Truro Review, independent review, comes upon us at the beginning of July. Not, in my view, enough. And that's why I'm grateful to ACN and Open Doors for their recent reports. Hear Her Cries and the persecution of Christian women and girls. They are moving and critical. And indeed, when I read Hear Her Cries, as a woman, I cried. And I brought a copy here for the Minister today. I implore you to read it. It is heartrending. Recommendation 5 of the Truro Review reads this, and I read it for the record, and because, fortunately, we have the liberty today of some time here in this debate. Bolster research, this is what the Bishop recommended, and it was accepted by the FCDO. Bolster research into the critical intersection of FORB and minority rights with both broader human rights issues, such as people trafficking, gender equality, gender-based violence, especially kidnapping, forced conversion and forced marriage, and other critical concerns for FCO, such as security, economic activity, etc., recognising the potential for religious identity to be a key marker of vulnerability. And this is the particularly important part of Recommendation 5, and use such research to articulate FORB-focused policies to address these issues. That's a critical question posed by that last sentence. It's one I hope will be specifically considered by the independent reviewers of the Truro Review. That's the question. How has any such research that has been done by the FCDO been used to augment, amend or develop government policies over the last 2.5 years so that the UK can better help tackle the tragic global phenomenon of widespread FORB violations against women and girls. What changes have been made to FCDO policies? Now, some good government-funded work relating to this issue has been done by the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, or CREED. And they state 4 reasons as to why women from religious minorities may be especially vulnerable to FORB abuses. I'll summarise them briefly. Firstly, when women are poor and they belong to religious minorities in societies where people from a different faith are often reviewed as the other, someone different or alien, then women can be particularly powerless. They can expect very little support from society as a whole. And I'll give an example later of a migrant woman from Qatar who fits this example. Secondly, creeds say that in some societies, the bodies of women who belong to religious minorities are being used as battlegrounds in wider political and geostrategic struggles. This can lead to them being targeted for ideological reasons, and their vulnerable position in society makes them even more vulnerable. And an example, of course, and we heard it from the Honourable Member for Strangford, and I will refer back to it again shortly, are the Yazidis in and around 2014. But we also know of the Uyghurs in China now. Terrible stories and accounts coming out of them being sexually abused, forcibly aborted. Thirdly, that some forms of sexual grooming of girls and women can be motivated by ideology. And again, I'll refer to this later, the example given by the Honourable Member for Strangford of the forced marriage and the forced conversion, justified by ideology from other faiths. And finally, women can face stigma, but not finally in terms of my speech, Minister and Madam Chairman. And finally, women can face stigma and discrimination in their own communities. Tragically, women who've been subjected to sexual violence are often seen as bringing shame on their community, and they can be targeted for honour-based violence from their own families and community. And this is why it's critical to work with whole communities, including religious leaders, to challenge the acceptability of violence against women, religiously motivated, and to bring about social change. We have got to make better explicit the links between gender, religion, marginality and poverty. Women in many countries appear to be victims not just of double but triple forms of persecution. They're women, they're of a particular religious or belief group, and because of their low socio-economic status. And they live in the margins. These different layers reinforce each other, making women particularly vulnerable. But it's insufficient for us to say we must raise awareness of the intersection of these vulnerabilities. We must be moved to action. Otherwise, religiously marginalised, economically excluded women will continue to fall through the cracks, experiencing appalling inequality, discrimination, persecution and violence, which will continue to be simply overlooked, ignored or minimised. And I do hope that the conference which the UK is hosting on the 5th and 6th of July this year on FORB will promote some really practical steps as to how we can address this issue and encourage working together with the international community concerned about FORB, encourage both governments and civil society to do so. I want to just unpack these thoughts a little, if I may, and I'm grateful to Stephanos Alliance International in this. They gave the example of the complexity of the causes of FORB abuses against women by way of a migrant woman in Qatar, for example. There is already a lack of legal protection for Qatari women in general. Christians are also a minority group there. They do not enjoy the same level of rights and freedom as the majority Muslim population. So a foreign Christian woman working as a maid in Qatar, who can often have her immigration papers confiscated by her employer, has therefore little or no hope of legal protection should he abuse her. Just one example of the multi-layered intersectionality of human rights violations for women and why women can be particularly vulnerable to FORB abuses. Another example of the differences between men and women in the terms of FORB violations is, as I've mentioned, that they often occur against women when they are hidden and, tragically, often perpetrated within a woman's own home. Of course, that's where women spend much of their time, in the private sphere. Even, sadly, this is perpetrated by her own family or community. Practices such as FGM, sex-selective abortion, female infanticide, forced marriage, child marriage, sexual violence, marital rape, honour killings, the denial of access to work, all of these fall into the category of religiously motivated FORB abuses at times. And if a woman converts to another religion, she may well have to face additional challenges from her own family, such as physical or emotional torture, to persuade her to deny her new faith. She may be excluded from family social networks, which can have severe consequences for a woman when these are her main, indeed sometimes her only social contacts. And leaving the family will not be an option when a woman whose educational and therefore job opportunities may also have been very limited, and she is therefore financially dependent on her family. And too, sadly, her chances of any recourse to justice can be severely limited. Too often we hear of the police taking no action, or of local courts if a young woman applies there for justice when she has, for example, been forcibly married, receiving no justice at all from them. Sexual violence, sadly, means that often there are no evident public repercussions. And when there are no evident public repercussions for the perpetrator, this makes the continued targeting by others of women for their religious beliefs a low-risk activity because of the impunity related to such crimes in too many places. Sexual violence experienced by many women often remains unreported because of stigma and shame. And sadly, it's one of the most common forms of FORB violations against women and many, many underage girls. The female body becomes a battlefield used by perpetrators to control a woman's personal faith or faith communities at large. I'm aware of one young woman in hiding now for well over a year in fear of her abductor who forcibly married, and when we talk about this, we mean rape and often continuous rape. She is too frightened to come out of hiding for fear of the whole community. Rape is widely used as a weapon of armed conflict, as we've heard and saw during the 2014 Syrian conflict affecting the Yazidis. Thousands of Yazidi women were abducted and held as sex slaves by ISIS soldiers. I heard of one, a young woman called Eklas. She was captured by ISIS soldiers. And when she asked them, "Are you going to murder me?" they said, "Oh no, we're going to make you suffer much more than that." And they took her as a sex slave. Those women then have faced challenges if they try to flee captivity, trying to reintegrate themselves into their communities, which have practices and regulations based around premarital intercourse or interreligious marriages. And as we now know, some 2,700 such women, many with children, remain missing today. I would appreciate it if the Minister could update me, perhaps not today, but in due course, as to what practical support and resources are being applied to help these women, following the answer which was given to me when I raised this question last on the 26th of October last year. Rape can also be used even in disputes between religious groups outside conflict. As creeds say, sexual grooming occurs of girls and women motivated by ideology. And shockingly, this can even sometimes be used with the appearance of respectability. Hundreds of Christian, Hindu and Sikh girls are reportedly abducted each year and forcibly married, justified by ideology. The ACN report Hear Her Cries relays the accounts of brave women of their kidnapping, forced conversion and sexual victimisation and unimaginable suffering. And I was going to read out the account of the little girl of Farah, aged 12, who was abducted in this way from her grandfather's home. I won't go into it because the Honourable Member read it, but that report, as I say, should do more than just move us to tears. It should move us to action. Tragically, also, whilst men are more likely to be killed as a result of religious persecution, they're also more likely than women to be celebrated as martyrs, whereas women subject to sexual abuse are not rewarded the same honour, but their complex trauma is often additionally burdened with re-traumatisation in the form of isolation and rejection from their very own faith communities. Blame falls on the victim. Suffering continues long after the event, and counselling is unavailable. So, what to do to address all of this? Perhaps I could ask the Minister to consider the following. We must ensure there is much wider help in terms of humanitarian assistance for such women, more extensive training for specialised trauma counselling. There need to be targeted programmes of aid for women and girls who face vulnerabilities as women of faith or belief, with those factors being clearly recognised as criteria of vulnerability by UK aid. Women need to be involved in designing and implementing aid and other support programmes. There needs to be strengthened dialogue and cooperation between women's rights activists and FORB activists to help overcome a perception that achieving FORB for all women is perceived as incompatible with women's rights. We need to call out when authorities in countries, including governments at the highest level, and I implore the Minister, whenever the opportunity occurs, to do so. We need to call out abusers when authorities turn a blind eye or tragically even condone at times action, such as, for example, where local policing or that country's legal system fails to protect women subject to FORB abuses. We must ensure that steps are taken against perpetrators to hold them to account and end the cultures of impunities. We must better learn how to identify early warning signs to avert atrocities and work with others in the international community to better do so. We must challenge those governments who have put FORB in their constitutions or signed up to international treaties like Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but don't apply them. We must gather data to better understand the double or triple jeopardy of women who are members of religious minorities, often also amongst the poorest and most vulnerable in their societies. More dialogue must be promoted within and across religious communities, including women at all times, to reflect on traditional practices such as patriarchal ones, which have a negative impact on FORB. We must help women in local communities voice their concerns. We need to look at how we can use the Declaration of Humanity, which was launched by Lord Armand, our Human Rights Minister, during the pandemic. It has not perhaps had the profile and subsequent impact it could have. There is more to do. What can the Minister tell me of how the UK government, which commissioned it, could help take this forward? And just because the Truro Review, which is a manifesto commitment, 3-year review deadline will shortly be upon us, is no reason for us not to continue to work on Recommendation 5 and on all the other recommendations. We must not stop just because the 3-year period of the Truro Review ends this July. Much more needs to be done. In closing, can I highlight to the Minister that from my experience working on FORB in depth and detail over the past year and 3 months or so as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, I do not believe that championing FORB and calling out its abuses across the world is sufficiently embedded in the culture of the FCDO today. Experience has shown me that the FCDO, both at desks here and at posts in countries, need to be bolder and more public in calling out specific cases of form abuses, not least relating to some of the women we've heard of today. Inadequate advocacy is being provided for individual cases of concern. I'm not being appropriately encouraged to undertake it. Tailored responses are not being provided to me when I raise individual cases of concern. Generic remarks in response to my raising such cases, such as FORB is a key human rights priority for the UK, are simply not good enough. Nor is the argument that, well, it's better to raise such cases in private. One such case I've been concerned about for almost a year and a half, and officials are aware of it, and still the poor girl continues to suffer. Arguments that raising a case by name could put an individual woman in danger when she is already effectively being imprisoned and at risk of mob violence are unacceptable, particularly when so-called in private advocacy appears to yield little result. In one such case, I was asked not to raise the name, not to name a young girl who'd been abducted because it might put her at risk. She'd been abducted by Boko Haram. She was at risk. Her family wanted her case raising. It's very interesting that we stand here today celebrating the freedom of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, whose plight has not been out of the public domain for 6 years. I'll close with the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the architects of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, "Where do universal rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighbourhood they live in, the school or college they attend, the factory, the farm, the office where they work. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere."